everyone. Welcome. We're letting people filter in right now. So if you want to go ahead and write who you are in the chat and say hi, maybe where you're joining from. And make sure you put the setting to all panelists and attendees so the other attendees can see your message as well. But I'm Erin. I'm joining from Zurich.
And this is Anna, Erin's colleague, also calling in from Zurich.
This is Sid. She's also calling in from Zurich. I'm also joined by my other colleagues, Teon and Florian. And then Jan is joining us from WWF in Amsterdam?
Brussels, Belgium.
Brussels.
Welcome, everybody.
Oh, hi, Hansen. All right, we'll let people filter in a little bit and I'll hand it over to Teon to go ahead and start doing some admin sort of tech setup stuff, and then we'll get into it.
Yeah. It just snowed today, so it's quite nice. I guess we can slowly start, right? All right, hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar, Aligning the Financial World with the 1.5-Degree World. The time for Buzzwords is over. So this webinar is our 10th webinar in our Think Big, Think Impact webinar series. And this is part of a project sponsored by the EIT Climate Kick. And it's great to have you joining us for this webinar today. I'm Tian Kwan, the Blended Finance Research Lead at the Center for Sustainable Finance and Private Wealth, which is a mouthful. And usually this whole moderation is done by Erin, so she does it way better. But since she's one of our expert panelists today, I'm stepping in on her behalf. And I'm joined by one of our comms lead, Anna, and she will be managing the tech side. So please feel free to write her directly if you're having any kind of issues. So I'll be moderating today, and before we kick off the webinar, I'd like to highlight a few features, and Anna can show you a little bit the slide,
Yes,
how it works.
Share my screen.
Let's see, exactly. So if you look at the bottom of your window, you should see a chat function and a Q&A function. So if you want to comment on anything, you can click on that chat. If you have any questions, you can go on Q&A, and our panelists will also be able to write in the chat or answer you via chat. But if the question seems super relevant, then I'll pick it up on the Q&A section and we'll try to implement it. Also, you can just leave it there and maybe we answer it at the end. Also, what's super important is if you go on the chat function and if you open the window, something like this will appear. And at the bottom, it says to panelists. And ideally, you should switch it to panelists and attendees so that everyone can actually see your functions. I see some of you guys are just writing to us, so please be sharey and nice and change it to panelists and attendees. All right. So this is it for housekeeping rules. Yeah, and then I'd love to introduce you to our speakers. So first and foremost, we're joined by Jan van der Mosten. He is a Senior Sustainable Finance Policy Officer at the WWF. And the focus of his work is to realize a shift in European investor strategies from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources. And that's why we brought him in today, because he can really offer a practice-oriented view on what it means to align your portfolio and move away from fossil fuels. Before that, he held the function of Climate and Energy Policy Officer at WWF Belgium. And that's also more or less his background. Then we have Erin Duddy, and she is the lead author of our recently published report, Private Banking and International Environmental Goals, Aligning Misalignment. So as you can see from the title, she knows a lot about what alignment and misalignment is. In her other functions where she's not doing research and writing reports, she is managing the IRI CSP Impact Investor for the Next Generation program and runs CSP's online programs and community management. Then we have Florian He, who is the lead author of The Investor's Guide to Impact. He's a researcher at CSP and holds a master's degree in environmental science from ETH Zurich. Before joining this, he also worked at South Pole for an extensive amount of time. And yeah, this is a really great panel that is well balanced with practitioner and practice-oriented experience as well as cutting-edge academic research. So let's get started and try to get the most out of this fresh and exciting panel. So yeah, the first question I thought might really introduce us nicely to the topic was, we hear a lot about aligning or alignment in the financial sector these days with something. So aligning with values, aligning with sustainable development goals, Paris Agreement. So what does alignment actually mean in your line of work? Perhaps Erin, you can start.
Yes, so in my line of work, I guess I would be responding to this in the context of the report that you mentioned. So we recently published a report, and I'll share my screen, but we published a report on specifically private banking and international environmental goals and how their activities align or don't align with environmental goals. So that's kind of, I had a closer look at what alignment actually means, because as you said, this is widely used in the industry, but it's not necessarily used consistently. And at the same time, we also hear it used in a very specific context often, which is portfolio alignment with climate change mitigation targets. So what alignment means for me in my line of work, I would pull this out of the report, and where we kind of look at the word more closely. And what we did in this report was we took an academic framework that looked at aligning sustainability within a complex system, which I think is really relevant for this topic, because of course, like environmental sustainability and climate change, this is a really complex system, and we have to think about like not just one component of that system, but how other parts of that system kind of affect the whole system functioning, or affect, for example, like how the finance industry affects the climate more specifically. And then the other part of it that I would want to highlight is specifically like the actions or activities within a private bank. Again, I'm talking from the private banking context, but we're often focused on investing, or just kind of the investing activities within a bank, but there's a lot of things that aren't necessarily focused on that it would really benefit. So it would benefit environmental targets and environmental strategies if the bank would broaden its focus beyond investing. And so for me, alignment would kind of go across these different components. So towards a target, making sure strategies align with that target, making sure actions align with these strategies, making sure you know what impact you're having on the target, and then also being able to measure that.
Yeah, I remember in the report you were also saying that, yeah, what does alignment, what does it mean for a bank, for instance, if we're financing yachts, purchasing of clients, right? So I think that was a really good example to lay out what alignment means that goes beyond just investment. So I also remember in the report you lay out a little bit what we're actually trying to align to, because that's also very confusing.
Yeah, and that we kind of got deep into that. That was also very confusing when we started looking at it. So there's kind of like, there's two levels that we could look at, which would be like the compliance kind of aspect of it. So what do banks actually have to align with legally? And of course, that would be more like national regulation. And for example, like the EU sustainable finance regulation coming up. But then there's the internationally agreed environmental goal framework, which includes like the Paris Agreement, but also a whole host of other agreements that would also be really important to align with. Right now, we're really focusing on climate, which is really great, but this climate is interlinked with a lot of other types of environmental issues. Like right now, we're seeing biodiversity, a big focus on biodiversity and how that's linked with climate. So I would point out, so I'd highlight the international environmental goals, and we've kind of illustrated them in the report. And also, of course, the sustainable development goals. This is, again, more aspirational, but there's a big financing gap there, and definitely more alignment is needed.
Super interesting. Continuing with the researchers, however, Florian, what does alignment mean in your context? And my understanding is also that you published a very interesting report recently.
Excellent. So as you mentioned, my research focuses on the impact of sustainable investing. And if I look at alignment, I mean, aligning with the Paris Agreement, aligning with the 1.5 degrees targets, it's really a buzzword right now. And I think my point here is that if alignment in the financial sector needs to have a closer look at causality and a closer look at impact. Now, what do you think? Do I think so? So that may sound a bit trivial, but if you look at alignment from a company perspective, say you're a producing company and you have a science-based target, kind of aligning yourself, your emissions with the Paris Agreement, what you do, so you look at your operations, maybe you find measures to reduce your fossil fuel consumption a certain amount every year. And I think here causality is very clear. I mean, you're the manager of the company, you decide for a target, you implement, your emissions go down because of your decision. So causality is not really issue. Nobody asks you, did your emissions really go down because you did it, and so on. But what the point we see in our research, unfortunately, the matter is much more complicated if you look at investors and if you look at alignment of financial institutions. So, and the reason is that every action a financial institution does, before it reaches the real world, it's moderated by financial markets. And that's basically what we have been doing research on the last couple of years, looking at how financial institutions and how investors can cause real world change. For example, real world change towards reaching the Paris Agreement. And I would like to share some short insights with you. Let me share my screens that we gained this research that may help to shape this discussion we're having right now. So 1 second, let's see whether it works. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Perfect. Nice. So a first insight that we gained, again, it may sound trivial, but impact is change in the real world that is caused by your activities. That has kind of two aspects. First of all, you have the change aspect. So something has to change. And if you're looking at climate alignment, 1.5 degrees alignment, it's clear what has to change. CO2 emissions have to go down drastically. So that's, I would say, the easy part. And the not so easy part in the financial sector, I would say, is causality. So if you observe emissions to go down, for example, if you're a bank and you look at your lending portfolio, your equity portfolio, if you see emissions from that go down, you need to have a look at causality. So you need to ask, what would have happened anyhow? What would have happened in absence of my climate actions I take? So this kind of counterfactual perspective, I think that's often overlooked, and I think it's crucial if we talk about the impact of certain targets. And we made the experience that if in the financial sector for impact in investors, it really helps to differentiate between two concepts. First of all, company impact and investor impact. So company impact, that's basically what a company causes in the world. I mean, we had, let's look at the car company, for example, Tesla. They build electric cars. They replace fossil-driven cars, so they may reduce CO2 emissions. I mean, you can have a whole debate on how do companies affect the real world, but that's, I guess, not what we're discussing today. I think the other very important part is the investor impact part. So the impact that an investor, a financial institution, has on the real world. And we define this as the change an investor causes in company impact. So not just the aggregate impact of the company an investor owns, but the change in impact. So we had Tesla before. So if we invest in Tesla, does an investment help Tesla build more cars, build more environmental friendly cars? So I think that's a very important view to differentiate between these concepts. And there's often a lot of confusion, kind of discussion focusing purely on company impact within portfolios and not on how financial institutions actually affect the companies within their portfolio or even without outside of their portfolio. And I think just a very hands-on conceptual example here. Let's say you're a green investor. You want to invest in a cool green company that has a lot of positive impact. You invest in a company. Before your investment, it was a green company. After your investment, it still is a green company. It didn't get greener, it didn't grow. So you have a green portfolio, but your investor impact then would be zero. If you compare that to the example on the right-hand side, if you invest in a deeply brown company with strongly negative impact on this planet, if you invested it and as an investor manage to make it become less brown, making pressure on the management to introduce some targets, some operational changes to reduce harmful emissions, for example, then you had a much stronger climate impact. So that's just some concept that may help us think. And we see two things that how investors and financial institutions can affect the real world, two fundamentally different paths. One is growth, helping companies to grow. And based on our research, we can say that only works under very specific circumstances. If you allocate to a company that it actually grows, namely for young, small companies, for in immature markets, developing countries, and so on, we do not find evidence that this works in very mature, large, established companies in mature markets. For example, Tesla, I mean, they have access to all the financing they want. I mean, just because you invest in Tesla, it's very unlikely that they will grow faster. I mean, the reason is if I buy a stock of Tesla, I just buy it from another investor. And really, it may, if I buy a lot of stock, it may have a small dent on prices, but this immediately creates incentives from other investors, hedge funds, to use this small arbitrage, so to say, and level out prices again. And it's unlikely to really affect a lot of change. And the other direction is this promoting improvement, which is often a bit overlooked. And voting your shares, shareholder engagement, so to entering in direct dialogue with management, maybe also screening out companies on clearly defined conduct-based criteria. The companies can actually change and improve over time. So here we say quite some evidence that investors can work with companies to improve them, that this has worked in the past, but it's more restricted to small changes, kind of step by step in changing the company you're invested in, basically. So that's just some conceptual insights from our research. And coming back to the general topic of alignment, I think my point is there's a lot of talk of aligning portfolios with 1.5 degrees targets and aligning financial institutions. I mean, there's two ways how you can align a portfolio with 1.5 degrees targets. One way is really working with the company you're invested in to make them become climate friendly and really look at the causality, the effect you have on the companies. The other option is basically shifting the boundaries of your portfolio. So kicking out brown companies, investing more in companies that are anyhow on the trajectory of becoming greener. This will also kind of enable you to have a portfolio that's kind of aligned and greener with 1.5 degrees targets, but it does not necessarily have a causal effect. And I think that's an interesting question out there. So what does alignment for financial institutions mean? Does it just mean having green portfolios, or does it actually mean making the real world greener, not just portfolios?
Yeah, really interesting, Florian. So basically you're saying, to sum it up, you're saying that if an investor, if somebody says, we're aligning our investment activities with the climate goals, then it might mean that the companies in the portfolio might be aligned, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the investor is aligned with the climate goals, depending on the impact.
Yeah, certainly. And I think, yeah, maybe
So,
1.2. Sorry, Tim, I give it back to you.
Yeah, so I mean, it sounds like it's quite difficult or quite challenging to align actually as an investor with the climate goals. So how does this factor into your daily work, Jan?
Yeah, thanks. Maybe I'll start by giving a little bit kind of an overview of the way that we see Paris alignment, and then I will get back to the question of impact and how to achieve alignment, because that's obviously a central point. And the way we have kind of approaches, and our approach has actually evolved over time by understanding kind of the challenges and such of alignment. And I'll focus on climate in this case. We're working on other topics as well, but for the sake of this conversation, let's focus on our approach on climate. And actually, we started working on this topic, say climate alignment, Paris alignment, like 5 years ago already, before it became such a big hot topic amongst financial institutions. And our approach initially was to raise awareness of financial institutions about the degree to which their portfolios were aligned with the Paris climate goals, by offering them tools that allowed them to assess this alignment and kind of create an understanding amongst financial institutions to what extent their portfolios were aligned or not aligned. And I think it's still an important first step if for an FI is to sort of understand what it means for them to align and how far they are in their current investments in terms of alignment with the Paris climate goals, because it can spur them into action if they understand that this misalignment actually carries risks to their portfolios. I think it's something, this understanding, this awareness is now achieved with a number of financial institutions, especially the more advanced financial institutions. They have understood this, and they have understood the need to take action. So we have moved away a little bit from this lateral engagement financial institutions on assessing climate alignment. We're still working towards mainstreaming such climate alignment assessment and disclosure through regulation. For instance, on the European level, there's lots of regulation now that would, if implemented in a robust way, would mainstream this need for financial institutions to assess the alignment and build this awareness on the need to align portfolios. So this is how we started our work. And then I think at some point we moved our focus towards getting asset owners not only to assess alignment, but also to take action to actually align their portfolios with the Paris climate goals. And this is what you have seen recently really pick up speed. There is like a flurry, like a lot of investors that are now, or financial institutions that are now taking these commitments to become net zero by 2050 or align their portfolios with climate goals. But these are often fairly high level commitments, right? And I think the challenge for us is to kind of make sure that these high level commitments, they actually are followed by concrete actions that ideally, right, lead to an impact in the real economy, like Florian was saying, actually influence the companies that these FIs are investing in. And that's why we believe that we need to really push FIs to take short-term actions, concrete action that is ideally based on robust science, so that they say, okay, I have this high-level commitment, but I will also take short-term actions, and I will kind of craft those actions on robust scenarios. Say, for instance, no or low overshoot 1.5-degree scenarios. And that's where we're focusing our efforts on right now, is kind of what kind of actions or what kind of tools can we provide to these FIs so that they can take those actions. And I'll maybe go through a few of the tools that we have and frameworks that we are working in to help FIs do this. I think a first one is for FIs to set science-based targets. And we have particularly been involved in an initiative called Science-Based Targets for Financial Institutions. It's a framework that was launched, I think, early October, and it provides concrete tools and methodologies for FIs to set science-based targets. And that kind of gives them an idea for individual asset classes, the level of ambition they need to have, like the direction that they need to take to align with climate goals. So that's one thing. It's setting these short-term targets. Look, for instance, to give a concrete example, a part of this framework is establishing what we call engagement targets. It's increasing the share of companies in an investment portfolios that have science-based targets, and how quickly do I need to increase the share of these companies with science-based targets in my portfolio in order for this to be aligned with climate goals. So this will encourage FIs to engage with companies to set science-based targets. Of course, that's not enough. Then I think there's also a need for FIs to develop concrete policies, investment policies that will allow them to see within my portfolio, for instance, for specific sectors, high carbon sectors, what's my approach towards these high carbon sectors or these very polluting sectors? How can I make sure that I develop an approach that shifts these companies in these sectors towards 1.5-degree alignment? And this brings me to this point of engagement and how does an FI engage in a meaningful way with a financial institution? I think our starting point is that FIs cannot engage with all the companies in their portfolio. Like a usual diversified investor will have hundreds, if not thousands, of companies in their portfolio. In our opinion, it's not possible for an FI to engage with all these companies. So what we have developed is guides for investors that provide them concrete criteria to assess to what extent a company portfolio is willing and able to shift aligned with Paris climate goals. If not, if it really is not in that position, divestment may be a better option than engagement. But then divestment has to come with clear public signaling. The FI should say, I am divesting from this company because I believe this company is not on track. And that will send a clear signal to the market. If then an FI decides that it wants to engage, it should engage with clear demands, which we also usually try to spell out for specific sectors, but also with an escalation strategy in place, because we are not in favor of endless engagement with companies without impact. So a clear escalation strategy, which can include sharing, filing shareholder resolutions, voting for shareholder resolutions, communicating publicly about your demands, voting against management, and if needed, ultimately divestment if after, say, a certain period of time, a company is not seriously engaging with an FI. So these are two, I think, points. I think what we find important is that FIs take action, and of course, at some point, there is a need to prove causality between the action that an FI is taking and the impact on the real economy. And I think that's something that we will build a better understanding about as we move along. But I don't think today, not having that perfect causality is a reason for an FI not to take action.
I see. Very interesting in terms of how you need to then also focus and target the companies. Do you have specific cases where an engagement process worked particularly well, or where it was particularly difficult and you had to end up divesting?
Not immediately. I think there is, I mean, to make it a little bit more broadly and to still point towards the challenges of engagement, because engagement is apologies, is often kind of seen as the holy grail to reach impact, but it's not an easy process. And you could say that there is a growing efforts within the financial sector to do this in a more structured and collaborative way, like Climate Action 100+ is a real good example of this, where they have started engagement with clear demands and a clear collaborative effort to reach those demands. But still there you see that there is some progress, but in our assessment, I mean, there is still, you still see that even within such initiative, and that's based on our outside experience with Climate Action 100+, that there is still a need for FIs in this initiative to be a little bit more pushy with their demands, to still be clear on the tactics and the strategies that they're employing against these companies, and then to also give clear signals when engagement is not enough and when they need to take this next step in their strategy. So I'd say there is progress generally on how FIs engage with companies, but there's also still a way to go, I believe, for engagement to really reach this, really be sufficiently robust to have like a large scale impact on companies. I'm not saying that in the individual cases it may happen and there is progress, but I think there's still work to be done on that level.
I see. Interesting. Florian, is there perhaps something we know from the research side on how engagement is done usually, or what's effective, what's not very effective?
Yeah, actually, there has been quite some focus on engagement. I mean, two questions: when is engagement effective, and also does it pay? And maybe what we see is there is like engagement can differ a lot. So we recently looked at an engagement database of a large asset manager, and there's a lot of kind of very low level engagement, just writing letters to the CEO demanding some more disclosure. Of course, that's kind of first steps that has been taken, but I think this has to be kind of clearly distinguished between really in-depth engagement where an engager really works with the management of the company. So that's maybe a first point. What we see from research, engagement is not equal to engagement. Maybe to add an example of that second kind of this really in-depth. I mean, a case I found interesting is Hermes, which is a dedicated service provider, also manage pension funds, so they have quite a lot of assets behind their back. They approached Sinopec, which is a huge Chinese oil major, on the topic of climate change. And based on this dialogue, they had like several year-long dialogue with Sinopec, educating the board on climate change. And after a while, Sinopec launched a methane reduction program. And so methane is a strong greenhouse gas, and it just leaks in oil and gas production. You can reduce it with technical measures. And based on this program, they managed to save something like 3 million tons of CO2 every year, which is kind of the CO2 emissions of the whole Bahamas per year. So quite strong, I mean, in terms of absolute impact. I mean, but it really shows that kind of effective engagement, I guess, is mainly if engagers really go to companies and spend some time and spend some effort in convincing management to take some action. And it also points out there's some scientific findings on under which circumstances engagements are particularly successful. And certainly the reputation and the size of investors is important. So Hermes is a very respected engager, so they gain access easily. But it also points out that it can be very valuable, I think, as Jan mentioned, to join forces and investors, to form coalitions, to join coalitions like Climate Action 100+ and others, because this just gives one request way more punch and way more strength. And then maybe another interesting aspect is that there has been quite some research. Doesn't engagement pay? Obviously, engagement is costly. I mean, Hermes is not working for free. I mean, as an asset manager, that's kind of the opposite of passive management. It's a very intense thing you do with the companies you're invested in. But there's quite some interesting evidence lately that it may actually pay. So that the companies that have been engaged on sustainability issues, especially companies that are maybe laggards, medium size, companies in developing emerging markets that haven't really started on the ESG travel kind of ESG journey, if these are engaged, it can actually pay financially, because it also helps to improve the governance structure. Engagement can bring in kind of knowledge and best practices into these companies, and on aggregate can make it profitable actually.
I see. So it sounds like that aligning investment, being aligned as an investor goes way beyond just, I don't know, allocating or picking stocks. Bringing back the topic to alignment, Aaron, perhaps could you elaborate what it means to be aligned as an investor that would actually allow to invest in engagement activities that seem to cost a lot of resources and effort?
Well, I could speak to a little bit what kind of gets in the way of investors engaging. And I think one thing that we found in the interviews and for our report was that a lot of investors aren't actually aware that they have this option. And this is either, so either they have a voting right if they have a mandate or with a mandate, and or if they're invested in a fund, the voting right is with the financial institution. But one way that they could actually use their kind of engagement power here is they can actually express their voting preferences, which according to fiduciary duty, the FIA should actually consider when they're voting. And so that's kind of like one option for investors that we pointed out in the report. But yeah, it is something that that we think is a little bit more resource or time intensive, so that could get in the way as well. However, the upcoming regulation for the EU Sustainable Finance Action Plan, our current regulation actually related to FIs is actually being updated so that they have to include investor voting preferences and suitability assessment. So that will actually make it a little bit easier for investors to express what their voting preferences are on these sustainability topics. But there also is kind of the role of the institution to nudge investors to actually engage. I mean, a lot of these topics are quite complex, and a lot of people don't necessarily have the capacity to go deep into these topics, like as like a private investor, for example. And so, the institution could make it a little bit easier for the investor to either inform themselves on the topic or just make the whole process a little bit easier for the investor to engage.
So Jan, you work with a lot of asset owners that are actually very engaged in the topic of engagement. How do they see it when this process seems to be so resource intensive and costly?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is different kinds of asset owners, of course, and you have the really big ones who have understood the issue and are willing to take action, are likely also more willing to put resources to engage with companies, right? And you can see this kind of group coming together in initiatives such as the UN convened Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, and they start thinking together about strategies to engage with companies. But I think also from an asset owner angle, they have started opening an interesting new area of work, is engaging with their investment managers, because ultimately many of the asset owners, and I think would be the type of investors are more inclined to seriously look at climate change and other topics because they have this long-term investment horizon, right? They often don't make actual investment decisions themselves, right? They outsource this to the investment managers who do them on their behalf, and often don't really have sufficient agency or influence over these investment managers to actually make sure that they make investment decisions that are aligned with their beliefs or their climate concerns. or will start engaging with companies on their behalf in a meaningful way, such as voting for shareholder resolutions aligned with their own views. So there you see that this asset owner alliance, but generally asset owners, there is some room to start a dialogue between asset owners and investment managers about how they should then better implement and take in account their concerns. And you see that that starts to happen. But as with engagement between investors and companies, where investors don't necessarily always ask the right questions, or the dialogue is not always as detailed and specific as is needed, I think there is also still, I notice, quite some work to still improve this dialogue between asset owners and investment managers. But that's definitely something that has to be developed further, and that we are interested to also develop our thinking about within WF, because I think that's really a key lever. And maybe building on this, like there is this, if you want to kind of shift this industry towards Paris alignment, there is like this really interesting point of intervention beyond investment management, which is more broadly service providers, right? So say you take a general, like many investors work through proxy voting advisors, for instance. And these usually have default proxy voting policies, which do not take climate in account at all. That's another way that you could where you could shift the industry, is by making sure that the proxy voting advisors, that they develop tailor-made climate voting policies, or ultimately integrate climate concerns in their default proxy voting policies. And maybe there is another way by which asset owners or investment managers, they could engage with these kind of service providers to make sure that there's structural changes in the way that they provide their services. You could make like similar arguments for credit rating agencies, benchmark providers, and such. So there's like so many levers that you can pull, and I think generally asset owners are well placed to ask these questions to various service providers that they are contracting.
This all sounds really great, but given the trend in passive investing in the financial sector, I mean, this is also a bit of a problem or a bit of a challenge. How do you, Florian, see this trend with relation to engagement and actually aligning that with climate goals?
Actually, I don't think that that's necessarily a problem, passive investing. So I think by now, most of us agree that climate action will pay. So, I mean, it may hurt certain companies, but in short time, but on the long run, it will benefit society, and it will benefit kind of markets as a total. And of course, I mean, you always have free riding. And if you're a small kind of an active manager that focus holdings on a few companies, you may have little incentives to push these companies to implement stuff that costs them but benefits the entire society and on the long run the entire market. But if you're a large, diversified, passive investor, you invest in the market, you invest in the long run. So actually it would pay to kind of push all the measures that on the long run help to fight climate change. And there's like an interesting paper stating exactly this point by Oliver Hart and Luigi Zingales, Hart being a Nobel laureate. So these ideas, they really come on. It would be, especially engagement for commonly climate targets that pay in the end would make sense for asset owners and asset managers to push. And I think, Jan, for example, you mentioned these voting policies. I mean, these services are out there. Several providers, they offer kind of voting policies where you as an asset manager can just purchase the services and they vote climate friendly on all the general assemblies you own stocks. But they're just very niche. So I think we're still at the point where these kind of things could roll out a lot. And also especially like the big asset manager, BlackRock and Vanguard, they start to move a little bit, but they certainly don't do really in-depth engagement with their companies, which I think would be, as they have a long time horizon for all the pension funds they're putting in money, it would pay. And I think maybe mindset has to shift. And it's also, I think, kind of a culture thing that especially in the US, I mean, there's this understanding of financially fiduciary duty that is very narrow on optimizing financial profit, and I think it just hasn't entered this very narrow narrative that we need to think broader if we want to think about financial return on the long run. And then suddenly financial duty could include kind of engaging with your company to make them greener, and or kind of to vote also for climate resolutions and all these kind of things. But I think there also a legal shift and culture shifts have to happen.
Aaron, I see you nodding a lot, and obviously this this also has implications on how the entire organization is run. Perhaps do you have comments to add to how regulation could somehow influence alignment for an organization?
Well, I think I'd want to comment on fiduciary duty, which is kind of a lot related to what that question is asking. And it's a really good point that you're making, Florian, because there's some good work that's going on by the UNFFI right now on fiduciary duty. So yeah, traditionally, fiduciary duty was just really narrowly focused on risk and return, and now it's the second, what's called like the second phase of fiduciary duty, or second era, is integrating environmental risk into the risk considerations. And we're kind of like at that phase, even like legally now, a lot that's built into a lot of legal frameworks in different countries. And we're moving into a third era, which is considering also the negative environment impact that your investments have on the environment. And I think in terms of regulation and the kind of the legal framework, that still needs to be set, but we're building it. And this project that the UNFFI is actually conducting is finding kind of support for that framework in order to make that the common understanding of fiduciary duty. So it won't even be aspirational anymore. It will just be what has to be done legally. It's compliance. And actually, to bring that back, I think Jan was touching on it a lot. He was referring to a lot of industry initiatives, and I think there's kind of this gap where industry initiatives can push policy in the direction of where we need it to go in terms of like making responsibility for the environment just an inherent part of the financial industry. And so I think institutions banding together to actually make that happen, it will be really important going forward.
I think it fits perfect. One of the questions that Austin raised is, what regulations might you all suggest could provide the greatest leverage for change, both immediately and for our needs over the next decade? So I see that fiduciary duty is one critical part to it. What else you might want to add to that, Jan?
Yeah, I think I don't know much beyond the EU, but I think in the EU you see that there is growing regulation already in place that will, I think at this point, in the next, say, 2 to 3 years, require financial institutions to start disclosing at least both the risks that they have with regards to climate and environmental topics, but also the impact that they are having on the climate and environmental topics, what's called a double materiality. So these reporting requirements, they will come into force over the next few years, and I think that will already have a big impact on the industry in the EU. I think specifically one file I know is since the EU disclosure regulation, where there is this requirement for FIs to disclose very relevant alignment of their investment with the Paris climate goals. It's in regulation, and now they will have to start really think about how they will do this, right? And of course that will have lots of FIs across the EU think about this, and then and start working with tool providers, methodology developers. So this will really kind of start shifting this debate a lot. I think EU taxonomy is another example of where this reporting requirements, I think will have a big impact. And I think where we then should gradually move towards over the next, say, maybe it's more a 10-year timeline, is that there will be, I think, over time, regulations that come into force, maybe in the EU or maybe in progressive countries before, that will start imposing on companies or FIs to kind of set targets, climate targets aligned with the climate goals, and ultimately impose on companies and FIs to start developing these transition plans that are needed to align with climate goals, to at least reduce their climate impact and environmental impact. So I think that's where we'll be moving towards, at least in the EU, in the next 5 to 10 years. And I think we'll start pushing it, at least at SWF, on corporate reporting files in the EU.
I see. Since you mentioned the taxonomy, well, Florian, what is actually your view and from your perspective of how alignment looks like on the taxonomy? Is there actually some risk for greenwashing or impact washing? Or do you think it's progressive enough? Or what would be actually your wishes within the whole regulatory frame?
Mm-hmm. I think I completely can connect to Jan, and I think Steve Rock in the chat on disclosure rule on investment product. I think we see an enormous demand for sustainable products. So I think the market is something like 31 trillions, and that's still 2018 numbers that needs to have grown until now. So a large part of all professionally managed assets is now somehow labeled sustainably. So from the investors' side, retail investors, I mean, also high net worth, there's an enormous demand for sustainable products. And what we in our research and others see, people are willing to pay for products with impact. But on the other side, it's really hard for people to understand what really has impact and what just looks green. So I think the danger of greenwashing, or I even more like to call it impact washing, is great. So impact washing meaning kind of having a product that somehow claims impact but cannot really sustain it. And there, I think what we discussed before is distinction, what's the impact of underlying companies and what's the impact of the product on these companies. That's a huge issue, that this is a really complex topic. So I was recently looking at the renewable energy clean tech fund of a bank that's, I mean, it's a long-standing fund, it performs well, and the fund managers, they really take pains in looking at the impact of underlying companies. I mean, so they know how much energy, renewable energy their companies produce, how much water they save, how much waste they save, even kind of their scope 3 greenhouse gas emission. They even took the pains of letting these data being verified by a very well-known third party. So that's all solid. But then they produce just lately marketing material that says, if you invest $1 million in this fund, you will save that many tons of CO2, you will save so you will produce so many kilowatt hours of renewable energy. And that's wrong. That's impact washing, to be very clear, because it did not in any way sustain or support how an investment actually makes these companies produce more renewable energy, save more, and that's it's very subtle, you know. It's impact of companies and the impact of the product. But if you want to have carbon reduction in the real economy, that's crucial. And that's a problem, greenwashing. I think it can go either way. And I think the EU regulation, it's currently at the point where it can go both way, in a greenwashing way and in an impactful way. We're discussing a lot with this whole being involved in this whole policy process. And I would say it started in a way that you just want to label green funds that contain green companies. It now also contains more and more of this impact view that you actually need to change something in companies, but it's open where it goes. It can go both ways. And if you would certify just green portfolios, then I mean, I fear a lot of momentum would be wasted. If the EU certifies funds that actually help companies to become better, this could create enormous demand for these products. And then that's kind of what we want, no? Have the markets play for impact, play for real economy reductions.
I see. And there was another question, and I know Jan, I asked already before, was there a specific case where, for instance, a company changed their actions to when an investor had engaged with them? Is there a case that you by now that popped in your head?
Yeah, I mean, no, like I think I could raise one point where I know there is kind of this very intense ongoing dialogue between investors and one company, that's Shell. So I mean, that's like with FIs, you have a growing number of oil and gas companies that take these net zero or Paris aligned targets and such. And I think in a way with Shell, as far as I know, the investor in the engagements of the investors, I think mostly through Climate Action 100 Plus, has really helped Shell to strengthen their position towards the point that they're recently, I think, adopted new targets and an approach to engage with their suppliers and such. That is starting to move into a positive direction. I would say still not perfect, but that's I think one example where you see that a dialogue between FIs and a company has resulted in some progress. I think what's important to take in account here with these oil and gas majors is that you also have outside groups like Follow This, for instance, that also like file these shareholder resolutions that are probably like more aggressive than what investors would file necessarily themselves, but it's kind of helps probably investors to increase, to kind of push their own demands and such. So that's also the inside outside approach, if you like, that can help to reach progress. Again, it's kind of this public facing part of pushing a company to take action, right? It's like you file the shareholder resolution, you make your demands clear, is something that I think is really very important for engagement by FIs with a company, because behind closed doors, bilateral dialogue, it just gives the company too much power over the FI. So at some point, you need this public facing element, which was done by FIs with Shell as well. So I think this is maybe one example I can think of that yielded results.
Thank you, Jan. Well, in that case, I'd like to close actually with Aaron and bring it back to alignment. And how could a financial institution in that case align with climate goals or with environmental goals to allow, for instance, or to prevent impact washing, to allow these engagement activities? What will your suggestions be, Aaron? And since you're at it, you could also perhaps answer why you decided to scope it to environmental aspect, since there's also a question on, well, what does alignment mean for the social aspect?
Sure. So I'll try to keep it brief because I see that we have a couple more minutes left, but we have a couple recommendations in the report, the private banking and international environmental goals. And it would be mostly about making sure that the strategy, so the environmental strategy, whatever targets that the bank is setting, are actually integrated across the entire business. So also with the processes and kind of decision-making processes and risk assessment, that those targets are integrated across the entire strategy. And also to consider all core business activities. So the holistic banking activities, not just investing. And have a strong scientific basis. And I know we've covered that pretty thoroughly in this webinar, but making sure that targets are science-based and also measuring the impact is also science-based. And the question about environmental and social targets, I think as a last point, we focused on environmental because that's basically, well, we were commissioned to do this report from the Federal Office for the Environment. So that was the reason behind that. But it's important to note that especially with the Sustainable Development Goals, you'll see that all goals, environmental, social, and economic, are all interlinked and interdependent. So you can't necessarily have one affect one without the other. So I think social aligning with social goals is also just as important. And there's just been a lot of emphasis on climate change mitigation in the industry in the past years, which is also very crucial, but we can't forget about the other ones.
Great. Well, my takeaway from that is that funding matters. And well, thank you very much for everyone who stayed and participating in the discussion, asking questions. Thank you very much, Erin, Florian, and Jan, and also Anna for the ongoing support. Our next webinar is titled Unlocking Investments for Water Entrepreneurship, and it takes place on December 10th from 3 to 4. And if you'd like to register, you can use the link provided in the chat or in the follow-up email that you'll be receiving. And we hope to see you there and hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.